Today's conversation is with Worshipful Brother Phil Queen. Worshipful in Masonic vernacular is taken to mean honorable, and this title is given to members of the Masonic fraternity who have served as Worshipful Master of a Masonic lodge for a period of at least 1 year. Typically, this distinction is reserved for Masons who have spent a great deal of time and effort in the study of Masonry and service to their lodge and community. Aside from his strictly Masonic achievements, what I find so interesting about Phil is that he's also immersed himself in the traditions of the Orient, having lived in China for a number of years, and has studied Chinese medicine, martial arts, herbalism, as well as the art of Gong Fu tea. Poised between the Western mysteries and symbolism of Freemasonry and the energy work and Eastern philosophy of esoteric Taoism, Phil has a unique perspective regarding traditions East and West, as well as his practical approach to their intersection. I sat down for some tea with Worshipful Brother Phil at Asheville Masonic Temple to discuss two of my favorite topics, Taoism and magic. I'm Mike Baker, and this is the Arcanvm Podcast. I've been meaning to sit you down and ask you a bunch of questions about everything you know about Taoist alchemy and energy work and stuff like that. But I don't think we've ever talked about how you got into it.
Nah, I guess not, man.
Yeah, because it's not every day that Westerners from North Carolina get into serious. It's a different story if you go down a rabbit hole on YouTube, but get into serious energy cultivation.
Right. Yeah, man. I mean, I don't know. I guess because I've always kind of been into what you might term the esoteric, just in general. And I think, like most people, especially in Western societies, that are into that sort of stuff, you go through that journey of, let's look at Celtic paganism. Let's look at Wicca. What's going on there? It's you go through all these things. Everybody goes through a dark phase. Ooh, the Necronomicon. What's that? Oh, that's bullshit. On and on, right? Yeah, so given that, I think one of my first real forays into that realm, two things kind of happened simultaneously. Are you familiar with Drunvalo Melchizedek's work and the Flower of Life?
Yes.
Arcanvm Meditations?
Yeah, I've not read any of that stuff, but I'm definitely aware of it.
Yeah, so I had gotten into that, and doing some meditations and energy chakra work there. I never went straight into Hindu Vedic chakra work. I did for a while, but it wasn't something that stuck with me. So I was really into Arcanvm meditations and light body sort of stuff. And then
is that what's in the Drunvalo Melchizedek thing?
Yeah, he was one of the first guys to come out with I know now that it's Atlantean technology, right? So you're spinning tetrahedrons in opposite directions and Fibonacci sequence ratios. And, yeah, it gets real wild, but yeah, so around that time, it was in college, too, that a guy named Fu Wei Zhong, or Zhong Wei Fu, I can't remember his name. He was a lineage holder, and I can't remember which one, we'll say 33rd, at Umeshan, which is a Buddhist mountain, actually, in China. And he had gotten some message from Spirit, what have you, to go out and travel the world and teach his Qigong form for free. And he happened to come to Asheville, I guess, because it's center for that sort of thing. And then he ended up giving a week-long Qigong seminar at UNCA, or on UNCA campus, for free, anybody that wanted to show up.
When was that?
This was back in the day. This is probably early 2000s. Late 90s, early 2000s. Yeah, and Asheville was just one of the cities, and America was just one of the countries. This dude was literally traveling the world teaching his form for free. Anyway, yeah, so that kind of got me into the Chinese realm. At the time, I was also studying martial arts. I was studying a kind of Gong Fu from southern China called Honggar.
Oh man, yeah, that's
Hong Chun.
Is that the is that the joint locking, the grappling?
That's a part of it, yeah. It's very hard external, It's one of those styles that like starts very hard and external, and then by the time you get to the final highest form, it's essentially like Qigong. You know, like the first one's like real like heavy sort of stuff, and then like by the time you get to the highest form, you're just like doing this, like
yeah, awaken the Qi.
yeah. Like, which makes sense because if you would have started me on that back in the day, I'd have been like, no, it's like.
Yeah, that's I had a similar experience. I started out. I worked with this this Thai teacher up in New York when I was there, and he had decided that my body type and everything like that, and just the way my gait, I'm very yang. We did more like yin sort of stuff, like the Wing Chun type of center line stuff, where
that stuff's cool. Yeah,
it's cool. My body has a hard time acclimating to that stuff.
Right.
But yeah, it really, like, by the time we were like a year and a half, 2 years deep into this stuff, it was like I was doing Qigong most of the time.
Yeah. You definitely have more of a Hung Gar style. You would be good at Hung Gar.
I've just heard so much about all the Hung Gar guys and like how intimidating that style can be.
Yeah. It's very like tiger-esque, you know?
Right.
But that's why it was kind of good for me, kind of like you. It's like my natural body type is not like super like muscular, heavy like yang. So it was a really good like conditioning for me. But yeah, so I was into martial arts at the time. Young college kid, you know, watching Dragon Ball Z, doing martial arts, and you know, this guy's coming to teach Qigong. I'm like, awesome, I'm going to learn how to like throw fireballs and shit. You know? Send
my Qi across the room, yeah.
But that really was like one of the first times that I had like direct experience with that particular thing, you know, the movement of energy through like channels and like the Chinese method of that. Because prior to that, it's like, I guess I just kind of stumbled into it because growing up I was always more into like Japanese martial arts, and I just happened to find this school, and me and a college friend started studying that style, and I'd also always been into like, I guess you would call it, I guess now they call it like holistic healing, herbs and stuff, like non-mainstream, non-pharmaceutical, like, you know, like what's allopathic, like Western medicine. It's like, there's got to be more to, like, there's other stuff going on here besides these guys seem super corrupt anyway. So that naturally with the martial arts got me into like Chinese medicine. I was like, oh, let's look at Chinese medicine, and it appealed to me because it was very like potion-esque. You're mixing like 15 different herbs that are prepared in different ways, and you're like making these little potions, you know.
Decoctions and stuff. Yeah, that's how you and I think started talking about the Taoist stuff, is because you know, I had studied Chinese medicine, and you were the tea guy here. You know, I showed up here at Asheville Masonic Temple, and you were the guy doing the Gong Fu tea service. You know, I mean, it's a little East meets West here.
Right,
you use a teapot as well, but it's you knew all the teas, and they were Chinese, and so I was like, oh, this guy seems into it. And then I found out that you lived in China for a time.
Right.
But we'll talk more about that.
Yeah, I remember that part when I met you, because you actually knew a bit about tea as well. Because a lot of people be like, oh yeah, I like teas, and then when I start talking about Chinese tea, it's like, oh, that's a little foreign, you know. In America, we definitely have more of a connection to Japanese culture, I guess, just from probably our influence there in the Second World War. But yeah, I remember I was like, oh, this guy actually not only knows a little bit about teas, the Chinese medicine too.
So you were doing Hung Gar, and you're studying that stuff, and then at the highest forms you ended up doing Qigong, kind of like subtle body movement.
Right.
At that point, was it just looked at as a physical thing, or were you focused, like you were saying? Were you working with the meridians and the Jingluo?
Yeah, not really until I started studying in like Chinese medicine. Once I started really studying Chinese medicine and like 5-element theory and like you know the different meridians and channels in the body and how that connected to some of the other stuff. Obviously, we're more familiar in the West with like the Vedic chakra system. Again, just because of I guess the cultural influence from that. But yeah, I mean that's whenever I started really realizing there was like something else there. There was something to it.
How old were you around that time?
I'm terrible with age, man.
Like probably
26, 25, 26.
20s.
Yeah,
okay.
mid-20s.
Yeah, that's a really good time to get into stuff.
Yeah.
Because like you get into stuff as a teenager, and you know it can be like you can go through phases, and it can be over in like a month. But I feel like
Yeah,
in your
for
mid-20s, late 20s, if you really start to enjoy something and get into it, you have the maturity to stick with it, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and like I said, I didn't even anticipate. It's not like something that I was trying to do or like wanted to do. From, when it comes to the esoteric stuff, I was definitely more into, the whole Celtic, pagan, even Egyptian stuff. That was kind of my thing that I found the most intriguing. But yeah, it wasn't until I kind of got into martial arts, Chinese martial arts, which led me to Chinese medicine, which led me to Qigong, and then ultimately to Taoist internal alchemy, of which Qigong is one part. There's a lot of other energy work and meditation and stuff that goes on with that.
So would you say that that's the aspect today that you're most interested in, the Taoist alchemy?
Mm-hmm. I would say so. Yeah, another thing, because I know you know a little bit about Western alchemy too, and I know a little bit about that. I mean, Western alchemy, I see like a mix of internal stuff that you're doing as well as like laboratory alchemy.
Yes.
And a lot of times it's like separated these days. I know people that are like legit laboratory alchemists that do stuff. And I know people that are full on like internal alchemists that like don't mess with like glassware.
The interesting thing is that the two kind of never get to, it's very rare that they meet each other. It's, and I don't mean like physically in person.
Right.
I mean, coming to an understanding, because there's a school of thought where so there's spiritual alchemy, like that's practiced in the Golden Dawn, which is it's based on the Salve et Coagula. We're going to take apart the constituent elements of your psyche, and we're going to do that in a ritual format, which essentially ossirifies you.
Right.
We literally take you apart. Your constituents are on the altar when you come in. And then we move them as you are being bound and wrapped up and mummified, really. And there's a spiritual alchemy, and you get to a certain point where now you have to put the pieces back together yourself.
Right.
You've spent time in each of these parts of yourself, calling forth this imagery and relating how that affects you practically in the world. What does fire look like in my life? Passion, what is creativity? What does that look like in my life? And then you come to know the good, you come to know the bad. You never really fully master it. I think that's why by the time you get that figured out, it's like, see you in the next life. But there's a branch of alchemy associated with that kind of Western Hermeticism that says, it kind of follows this microcosm, macrocosm theory. Okay, so the spiritual process I want to occur to me, I am going to put this plant material through.
Right.
And that is going to be a microcosmic example of what I want in my comparative macrocosm to have happen. And so it's not even just the process of going through the alchemy and, distilling, and it's then taking that inward.
Right.
Having it be potable and absorbing that essence. And like you say, it involves a certain amount of meditation, and certainly I would say invocation of the highest has to happen. That's something that Chick Cicero says. Like, the main difference between an alchemist and a chemist, one prays to God before the operation starts.
Yeah, I've heard that. The other one that I've heard that I like is the difference. What separates chemistry from alchemy is that the alchemist considers him or herself to be the key ingredient in the formulas. Right. Recognizing that consciousness affects matter and intentionally affecting that. Right. Yeah, with purpose, not just like not knowing what you're doing.
Yeah. Because that's, especially even in spiritual alchemy, that's really all we're talking about. Consciousness. Yeah, that's what you're working on. You're working on your. There is nothing else. That is the prima materia. Because it all starts there. Even like your physical life, your body. It's ultimately your consciousness that decides what kind of food I'm putting in my body, how much sleep I'm getting, how much exercise I'm getting. It's your consciousness is the command center, and that's really what we're working on when we talk about spiritual alchemy. But have you ever seen or been a part of or taken part of laboratory alchemy in any way?
Vaguely, yeah. A friend of mine has a laboratory, which I haven't seen. I just know it. I kind of nerd out on it. Like, I'm into that sort of stuff. I like watch YouTube videos on it and stuff, but I don't have like direct experience with creating that. Except for Ormus, I've made Ormus before, but yeah. As for actual like spagyric tinctures and stuff, it's something I'd be really interested in getting into. But I live in an apartment, and I'm looking at doing crazy stuff. So you're probably gonna need like a fume hood for. You know?
Yeah. Well, I'll build that over at my place, and we can.
Yeah,
we can do that. So I guess the Chinese herbal tradition does come into play for you. I know that you're a big fan of. I mean, that's putting it lightly. Yeah, you're very much interested in teas, and that's part of what you do for your work. And but how does that work personally with the work you do?
As for like herbal medicine and stuff like that, it's definitely something I still use in my daily life. Because my undergrad degree was in traditional Chinese medicine. So after school, I was like, I could go, like you were saying, and spend that 4 years and actually get licensed to practice, and then I could start up a business and like get clients and that whole 9 yards. Mm-hmm. Instead, I just wanted to go on adventures in China, so that's what I did.
Tell me about that, man. I think I heard through Stanford, and I think maybe your dad might have mentioned it when he was here.
Yeah.
That you had lived in China, but I never really heard too much about your experiences there, why you went, how long you were there for.
Yeah, just having studied traditional Chinese martial arts and then traditional Chinese medicine and getting more insight to the culture of it, I was like, I didn't want to, first of all, I wasn't ready to settle down, spend 4 years and a couple, grand to build a business and just like sit here and do that for the next like 20, 30 years. So I definitely wanted to go on adventures. I definitely wanted to see China, right? So I was like, well, I'll just go over there, get licensed to teach them English. Mm-hmm. If I don't like it, then I'll like come back. And I ended up staying for about 5.5 years.
Wow.
Over there.
I did not know that.
Yeah. And I never actually even came back to the States during that time too, because it was like, I could spend $1,000 to fly back to America, which I already know, or I could spend like maybe $200 to like go to Thailand and see like stuff I've never seen. So that's what anytime I had vacation, I would just travel somewhere else in Asia.
Did you study anything there?
Well, it's funny because at that time, like I was more into adventuring as opposed to like learning stuff. I was definitely in the Chinese medicine. That was one of my motivations for moving to another city. I started out in a small city in the south of China. It was small back then. It's gotten much bigger since then. Zhuhai is the name of the city. It's now connected to a bunch of other places and stuff. And then I moved further north to a city called Hangzhou, and realized too at the time, like Zhuhai, I don't want to get too much into like a history lesson. But like in the 1980s, when Deng Xiaoping was trying to open up China, he created these things called special economic zones, and the whole idea was to infuse a bunch of money into it to like build this city and make it like an economic center. Mm-hmm. And that's how like Shenzhen was created, right? Like Guangzhou was like an old city, whereas Shenzhen was like a brand new city that was just kind of like built. It's now like one of the largest cities in China. It's like the tech capital of China, which kind of makes it the tech capital of the world in a lot of ways. Yeah. And Zhuhai was the same thing. It was a small fishing village until they spent like probably billions of dollars, I don't know, into like building this city, and now you have this brand new city that was built in the 1980s. Mm-hmm. So it kind of had that feel, whereas Hangzhou was the capital of China and the Southern Song dynasty. So it's an old city that's been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. It's got like these ancient gardens there. Westlake, that's where Dragonwell or Longjing tea comes from. So there's like tea plantations everywhere. It's definitely more traditional. People, playing erhu and stuff in the streets. Mm-hmm. That's where the Chinese Medicine Museum is. One of the reasons why I went there. It's just a cool city.
How long did it take you to learn the language? You learned the language, right?
I learned enough to be independent.
Right. Did it take you a long time? Were you studying before you went, or?
No. I literally showed up. I think I got like a CD or something and like listened to it, and it tells you ni hao. Okay, I can say hello and like thank you, kind of. I picked it up while I was there, partially because you have to, because nobody spoke English, right. But also I wanted to learn a language, so I had a tutor a couple of times. When I moved cities there, obviously my tutor lived in that city, so it's kind of a bummer. She was really good. Yeah, it's a perishable skill too, because I have very few chances to practice now that I live here in Asheville. So yeah, if you don't use it, you lose it. And
when I was in school for Chinese medicine, I was around a lot of people who had, grown up in China and moved to the U.S. in like the 80s and 90s. And it's a wild language. Tonal.
Yeah, it's a tonal language.
There's just different tones for the same actual like phonetic word or sound or syllable. And depending on the tone you use, meaning like inflection, it is a musical language. It means something completely different. Which that was like, I don't know if I'll ever be able to learn. I learned a little bit of the pinyin, right? Because you have to for herbal, But.
Yeah, it's there's actually not that many phonetic sounds in Chinese. It's the tones that distinguishes them, and even then, there are some same sound, same tone. It's just depending on how it's used in a sentence. Context. Yeah, context is a big deal.
You keep up with what's going on there still?
Yeah. So
think about going back?
I mean, if they ever like get it together, they're kind of losing their minds at the moment.
Well, everyone is. Give me the rub behind, like, well, go ahead. Tell me.
Well, I was going to say, it was also in college that I was first introduced. I started seeing this lady who was doing, it's like, now that I reflect on it, she was doing some like mixture of like counseling, but she was also using like numerology and some sort of like energetic healing work. I don't know what it was. It wasn't Reiki. That's the one that most people do these days.
Right.
It was something else. I don't even know if it was something that you could learn or if it's just her intuition, but it was like super powerful. And she was the first person that introduced me to Michael Wynn's work, who does like Qigong and like Taoist alchemy and stuff like that.
Do you find that his work is reliable for that kind of stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. And I had gotten into it back then, and then I kind of like moved on. Right, I graduated from school and hung out here in Asheville, and then I like moved to China and had adventures there, and then came back, and it wasn't like many years later until recently that I like kind of like rediscovered that and like went back into it and realized like, oh, this is like the stuff I was looking for, because it was we're all on our journey, right, and we're only exposed to certain things. If you're not exposed to something, you don't even know it exists, so you're not gonna get into it, but doing like energy work, being into alchemy, and then I realized like, oh, this Taoist alchemy stuff, like this is kind of like where I'm at now. This is it's a whole different thing.
So with the advent of the internet and social media and just this self-marketing in hyperspeed that everybody does, like everything about everyone.
Right.
There's a lot of things that I would prefer to keep private. That a lot of people openly share. And, being a part of certain magical groups or spiritual groups or energy work groups, there's usually teachings. And a lot of times if you're not a part of that circle, you're not going to hear the teachings. And if you are a part of the circle, you're obligated to withhold some stuff. So taking that into consideration, I don't really know if you belong to a practicing group or anything like that, but what can you say about Taoist alchemy? Because I don't think it's very accessible to Westerners. I don't think we understand it.
No, yeah, you're definitely right. And there's not a lot written down about it either. That's the other thing.
Well, that has been translated.
It is interesting because what we know the most that we know in the West now, kind of originally was brought from like Montauk Chia and his work, right? I'm not sure if you're familiar with him.
I'm not.
He was one of the first people. So he's Chinese-born Thai, right? But he was one of the first people to like bring this stuff out and like give it to the West, which is obviously kind of controversial. There's a number of, particularly when you get into like lineages and stuff like that. Like certain forms of like Tibetan Buddhism or whatever. It's like you got to devote yourself to that, or you're not going to learn it. They don't just give it to any old person,
right?
And there's a lot of things that you'll probably never get, And only recently have I started seeing stuff come out. Particularly, I'm thinking of like the Tibetan bone tradition, right? It's always super secretive for the longest time, but now certain people are being authorized to like teach some of the I guess you would call it Tantra, but it's essentially like energy work. I know that when I say Tantra, I'm not talking about hippies having sex.
Yeah. No, I understand completely.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like for example, like Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche was like one of the first guys to like bring that sort of like, we'll call it like chakra work, like energy work from like the Tibetan Bon tradition. Super secret before then. It was never taught to anybody outside of Tibet. Even in Tibet, you had to like be part of that group for years and dedicate yourself to it.
There's merit to that.
Yeah, there absolutely is. Yeah. But I don't know. I guess the world is ready for it, or the world needs it, or something. Whatever forces are at work, it's like, okay, it's time. So that started coming out. So it's kind of the same thing with the Taoist tradition, only the cultures are so different that you can't really compare them. For example, China had the Cultural Revolution, right, where the whole idea was to stamp out any sort of superstitious, like religious, spiritual stuff.
Right.
Even that happened to Chinese medicine.
We're going through that right now.
Yeah, like
where like children are terrorizing their parents.
Yeah, a lot of that stuff was either like erased from Chinese culture, or the people that kept it left the country, and now it's like in other places like America or Canada, like Germany. A lot of the Hungar people went to Germany, actually. It's like some of the best like Hungar schools from like the actual like Chinese lineage holders.
Interesting.
In Germany, oddly enough. So yeah, it either got dispersed or it just got kind of not whitewashed. That's not the word, but you kind
diluted.
Diluted, yeah. It's like, oh, now, even today, like if you go to China and start talking about some of the more like in-depth practices, like all the like Taoist monks, like, yeah, we don't know about it. We don't do that. It's like we do like the microcosmic orbit and stuff.
Right.
You start talking about like isolating fire and water and transposing them and like fusing them together, and they're like, oh, that's some crazy shit.
That sounds amazing.
Yeah.
So is that part of your practice? Obviously the breath is intimately involved, right? Mm-hmm. In pretty much every spiritual tradition there is the word for energy or spirit is the same word for breath.
Yeah.
But are there visualizations, postures?
Yeah. Definitely meditations, definitely visualizations. You're probably familiar with the microcosmic orbit.
Yes,
correct?
it's connecting the Du and the Ren channels.
Exactly.
The yin and the yang. Do you ever study any Acu?
A little bit, yeah. Like I did a cursory study of every aspect of Chinese medicine, from diagnosis to all the different treatments. But I was most interested in herbal medicine. That was the thing that I find the most intriguing. The meridians are definitely used in Taoist alchemy, although we're not like needling things. It's not a medicine, but I didn't study the needling in depth like you would at like an acupuncture school. Yeah, and all the other ones, the cupping. Did you guys do cupping?
Yep,
and,
absolutely.
And gua sha, the scraping.
Yep, scarring.
Yeah.
Really. But so you were getting at something with the microcosmic orbit,
right? Yeah, so take the microcosmic orbit as an example of something that you can. There are multiple variations, and different ones are going to be used for like different things. At the base level, you're moving chi, up the spine, down the front, circulating, that sort of thing. But imagine for example, imagine the chi concentrated into a sphere, and now spin it up the spine, and spin it down. Or do it the other way, running fire down the water channel and water up the fire channel. Now you're creating this friction there. It generates more energy doing it that way. That's where you start opening doors to alchemical stuff, right? It's like if you're taking water and moving it up, because water sinks, right, and fire rises. But now you're doing the opposite. You're like pushing the fire down and bringing the water up, and that's going to cause them to.
Right,
steam and
when fire and water interact, typically in any actual volume, it's volatile, and energy is created. A third element is created, vapor, air.
Yeah, right. And the other interesting thing is you need a third element to make that reaction happen. If you just throw water onto a fire, it's going to put the fire out. If you just throw some flaming logs into the ocean, nothing happens, right? Like if you want to create steam. If you want to like cause a phase change to cook something, for example, like you got to have fire, got to have water, but you need like a vessel, right? And in Chinese Taoist alchemy, earth is that vessel. Because remember the difference between Western and Taoist alchemy. One of the major differences is that China has a 5-element system, right? It's not earth, air, fire, water, ether. I guess there's 5 in West.
There's 5 in the West, but it is different. It is very, very different.
Yeah, because air is not one of them. You know, we got earth, fire, water, metal, wood.
Yeah.
Right. Like, what is all that about? You know, when I first heard about it, it's like, I don't know. That's kind of a cop out because metal and wood are both earth, right? But like, no, the properties are very different.
And my understanding of it, because you work with this constantly in TCM, traditional Chinese medicine diagnosis. This is how you come to understand the landscape of an individual. What's going on in their landscape is what are the elements doing, but they represent, right? It's 5 phase theory. It's 5 phases, and the phases are always interrelated. You know, there's the governing cycle, the controlling cycle, and the insulting cycle, the generating cycle. That's the one I'm talking about. But so it's kind of this permutation of phases.
The Taoist system is very like earth centric. You know, like in a lot of other what is called in spiritual traditions, if you will, they're either about like going somewhere, whether you're going like into the astral or going into like the past, the Akashic, or you're like cosmic, you're like going out into the universe, that sort of thing. You know, like the Taoist system's very like earth centered, and it makes sense. You know, like we live on this planet, you know, where our bodies come from. You know, this is our perspective, right?
Right.
It's very like experience, like body centered stuff too. Like there's definitely meditations, but you're not trying to like quiet the mind or go somewhere else. You're trying to go inside or go into the earth or be with your mind, that sort of thing. I know that's a little abstract.
Yeah, I mean, not really. I think, you know, I feel real progress when I engage in particularly, you know, the different types of Qigong. A lot of people don't understand. Like, I had a couple of people from, you know, one of the spiritual groups that I'm a part of, you know, ask about, well, how do I learn to feel qi? It's like, well, you have to do qigong. I mean, that's like the first thing you need to do is do those types of associated meditations, and you have to learn a qigong form. You know, and my go-to is Jamzong. Jamzong is my go-to because it's standing meditation. It's not as involved as, say, like the 8 pieces of brocade and harmonizing the 5 elements and things like that. They're not as physically challenging. So what's happening is I'm spending enough time in these postures, doing the breathing, to actually feel some kind of sensation. That for me was when I began to feel my energetic body.
Right.
You know, but the thing is, they'll go online. They'll you know, YouTube search or Google search Jamzong, and they'll get everything in the steps. 1, do this. 2, do this. But you don't get the visualization. Right. And the visualization is the most important part.
That's the key, exactly. Yeah. It is. Yeah, and you were talking about, you know, utilizing elements in your life and that sort of thing, you know, I remember the example I was going to give, it just popped back in my head, but because we were talking about Earth, right? And Earth, you know, like, it spins around. It creates our day and our night, right? It goes around the sun. It creates our year. Like, Earth is intimately connected to time, our perception of the passage and knowledge of time. And people with a weak Earth element, you'll notice that they have a hard time, like, keeping track of time. If someone's, like constantly late, they're always showing up late, I could guarantee you there's, like, a lack in the Earth element. That's what you would focus on. It's like, oh, they're having trouble, like, connecting with this concept of time, you know, and that's just from basic knowledge of how our planet works, you know.
Yeah.
So like, and all the elements are kind of like that.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
So what is like do you have a daily practice, or is it more like weekly or whenever you feel like it?
Well, to be honest, full disclosure, recently I've been kind of slacking on it, but normally I have a daily practice, and like once a week I try to go like real deep, right? So I'll do some stuff every day, kind of like maintenance, depending on whatever I'm trying to accomplish in my life at that time. But then like once a week I'll like set aside time, like an hour or two to like really go into it.
Yeah. What does a daily practice typically look like for you? Just curious.
Yeah, so aside from like sitting or sometimes standing meditation, I've really gotten into it's a basic form, and it's got a couple different names, and it's been taught by a few different people, but it's essentially like a qigong form that incorporates all the directions and all of the elements, and it's a perfectly balanced form. So that you may have heard, because you were in Chinese medicine, that like you don't do certain qigong like when you're sick, for example, or I've heard not to do it like during like thunderstorms and things like that. But if it's a perfectly balanced form, like the yin and the yang are like harmonized, the point of the form is harmonizing. You can do it like anywhere, anytime, and it's one of those that you can do it like real quick, or you can do it super slow, just depending on your time or how deep you're going. And it's really just the first layer, because once you start adding, I don't want to get like super deep into it.
No, this is cool.
But like once you start moving up the system, right, and harmonizing the elements at different levels, the form like completely expands. And if you are pulling in more cosmic stuff, like because essentially we're talking about harmonizing opposites, right? I mentioned fire and water. But yeah, if you start harmonizing, like, if you imagine like the male aspect of you that's connected to all your male ancestors, that entire side of your lineage, your genetic lineage, and then all of your female ancestors and the feminine side, same thing with that, harmonizing and doing the same stuff, reversing, putting the male in the female and the female in the male,
right, and
then like merging those. So in Taoist cosmology, you have the Wu Wei, which is the emptiness, the nothingness, the great unknowable, right? And from that, from the nothingness, you get the somethingness, which is called Tai Yi, the great one. So that's like the oneness, the unity of all things, right? And from that, and there's still, it's neutral. There's no yin and yang. It's just either nothing or something, right? And then from that is when you start getting all the other things that trickle down. Eventually, it will separate itself into like yin and yang, and then of course, from Chinese medicine, you essentially have like, let's put it this way, like one thing that's not that common in modern qigong in Chinese medicine is because you mentioned that there's yin and yang, right? And there's that harmony, that balance. But you also know, because I know that you know this, because we talked about this, that there's always a third element.
Right.
There's always a third one somewhere, right? So there's the yin and the yang, and then there's what's called yuan, or the neutral, right? And that applies to everything, like Jing, Qi, and Shen.
Right, the three treasures.
Yeah, so there's like Yang Qi, Yin Qi, and Yuan Qi. So like a lot of the alchemical work is working specifically with that neutral force, because it's something that we don't have a lot of in this world. We're a very polarized world. We have night and day, male, female, so on and so forth, all that stuff. But that's, and even a lot of Chinese medicine is still working in the what they call postnatal arena, or
original
later,
tree,
later heaven sort of situation. So even a lot of qigong, is working with like yin and yang qi as opposed to working with yuan qi,
right?
And that's one of the key goals in Taoist alchemy, is to build a neutral force.
And it's the same thing in Western alchemy, right? We're trying to find the androgyne. They call it the alchemical marriage, and the product of which is the rebus, which is the two-headed masculine and feminine brought together in one body.
Right.
I mean, it's the same thing, It's just different. I find it really interesting, actually, that there's an historical Taoist, on the historical record in China, they have Taoist treatises from like the 1st and 2nd centuries BCE. Okay, so we don't really have that here, at least on the historical record. And I remember reading, I forget who it was, which is bad because I should have done my homework and wrote his name down, but the oldest extant treatise on alchemy in China was written it's called like Popeye or something like that.
Yeah.
But the oldest extant or historical record of an alchemical treatise in China is so obscure that they can't even refer to it for anything.
Right.
So they have to go to like the second oldest one, which is not as obscure. So even back then, alchemical treatises were being written that don't make sense to anybody. So they even have that in common, East and West.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So here's a big question. Have you experimented with magic? Are you willing to talk about it?
Experimented, yes, I would say that.
Yes, you have.
Yeah, I've spent time.
I used to ask people, well, how would you define magic? But definitions are shoddy. They're difficult. They don't really express what I was trying to get at. I'd leave not having my question answered. So I found that a better question is, how do you or did you experience that magic?
It's interesting. I didn't think about this until now when you asked that question, but obviously I appreciate and enjoy ritual and ceremony. Being a Freemason, I enjoy that. I've found that a lot of the things that either I was looking for or attempting to accomplish through the use of magic, I feel more successful and more well-rounded and grounded doing that without magic. But still appreciating the ritual and the ceremony. So I don't really, do magic ritual or magical ceremony anymore, even though I do what I would consider magic, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
But then on the other hand, I'm still doing ritual and ceremony, right?
Right, yeah.
And of course, we have our own, own ceremonies in Taoist traditions and stuff too. It's a little different. But, yeah, I'm not sure if that fully answered your question, but
I would totally consider everything that we talked about in terms of the visualization and the energy working. I mean, that is magic, because you're moving. So you're working on what we would call in the Western tradition. You're working with the etheric. Right. That's the chi. That's your personal chi. Yeah. And there's cosmic chi also. That's that's etheric energy that's out there in the world. Right. And how are you moving that? You're moving that with a series of images.
Right. Intention, images. And
that's working on the astral. So you're doing magic, right. It's just personal. It's a solo practice, So because, we're given a lot of this stuff in other magical traditions, like the exercise of the middle pillar or the exercise of the 3 pillars. We're using a Kabbalistic framework, right? Our astral kind of scaffolding, if you want to call it that, is we're imaging the Kabbalistic tree of life in our aura or sphere of sensation and using that to guide the energy and awaken certain things. But that's really what magic is. It doesn't matter if you're... Right. I personally don't think you need to do it with other people. And I do think magic is... It's not necessarily consubstantial with ritual. I think even when you sit down to do your practice, there are probably, although when you sit down to engage in your practice, there are probably elements that you do the same every time, whether that's, just opening up with something as simple as the 4-fold breath. Right. So that in and of itself creates a tiny personal ritual. Yeah, and I might go so far as to say the goal is different. I'm not sure. It depends on what your goal is. I think, ultimately, I think one of the largest goal, at least in Taoist alchemy, is to not only harmonize, the opposing forces in yourself, and when I say yourself, I mean every aspect of yourself, energy, body, spirit, mind, body, all that stuff, as well as physical body. But really, if I had to, break it down and give, a definition or an explanation of, what the goal is, it's essentially to build a neutral force in your system so that you can get closer to source. The whole thing is to return to source, right? The creation that we all came from, whatever that is, Yeah. And you're using these practices to pretty much speed up your spiritual evolution so that you get closer to source energy. Yeah, I would say that that's completely consonant with most forms of Western magic. The problem is that most people, I mean, this is a generalization, but in my experience, most people that join things like the Golden Dawn, they never stay in it long enough to see that this is ultimately what it is.
Right.
You know, not many people, you don't even have to make it to like the inner order of the Golden Dawn to realize that this is what we're doing. It's just that so many people, there's this kind of aesthetic that is this whirlpool that like pulls people in for aesthetic reasons.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people, maybe in the Western tradition too, and I guess I was kind of guilty of this, like the concept of magic as we know it, you know, Chinese don't really have that same concept, right? And I think it appeals to people, the imagery. It's like, oh, I'm going to learn to like, because, you know, the like you were saying, the ultimate goal in Western tradition, including alchemy, is the same as the ultimate goal in Taoist tradition and alchemy is, to speed up your spiritual evolution, to get closer to source, closer to God, right? Yeah. Which doesn't really sound appealing to a lot of people. And when, you know, because if the goal of magic was to find love or to like get rich or to like gain power, like that's a definite goal. Like people want like money and power and love. Right?
Yeah.
But like not the average person wants to get close to God.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems like that's just not as sexy as like, you know, driving Lambos with like a bunch of women and like, you know, power.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, that goes back to something I learned in Chinese medicine school. When a patient comes in, and this wasn't part of like your protocol. Like if I wrote this down on a test, they'd be like, "What is this?" but something that I heard that really resonated with me, particularly because I had just started attempting to get sober at that time.
Right.
Was one of the most important things when a patient or client comes in, before you do any diagnostic examination, the first thing you have to ask them is, are you willing to abandon the things that are making you sick? Are we going to waste our time here? Or
it's a legit question.
And that's the whole thing. Like you were saying, you went to China not to learn but to adventure.
Yeah.
And everybody's in that adventure. Well, not everybody, but so many people, particularly that I have seen that are drawn to magic, are in an adventure phase.
Right,
they're not because you got to let go of a lot of stuff. You have to lay a significant portion of your life on the altar of sacrifice if you're trying to get closer to source.
Right.
Who wants to do that, you know? I mean, you eventually you'll have to, but
I like the way, I think it was Joe Rogan that put it this way. It was like, you know, a lot of people are just kind of dabbling in the idea of like improving themselves. Nobody really, the average person doesn't really want to put in the work to do it. You know, they're playing around with it. Oh, I can like improve my life. You know, like let's dabble in it and see. But when it comes down to actually doing real stuff, I mean, I guess you see that in everything. In Masonry, I see it in the junior deacon's chair. That's when you're no longer dabbling. You know, you're in it. And it scares a lot of people off. You know, they're like, okay, it's like, I didn't know it was going to be like this.
Junior deacon, really?
Yeah.
I love that chair, man.
At least in this lodge, you know, I've noticed that, like, the junior deacon, whoever sits there realizes that, like, oh, like, I got to do all this stuff. Yeah. And, like, next year I'll be senior deacon, which puts me, like, just 1 year away from being one of the 3 elected officers. You start seeing the East, you're like, oh, shit, like, this is real. Yeah. And I think, you know, a lot of people, for various reasons, you know, maybe they, you know, have a lot going on in their life, having a third kid, changing jobs, moving away, whatever it is, you know, realize that commitment isn't there. But, yeah, like you said, it's a sacrifice. But that's the point of a sacrifice, is you're getting something better in the long run. Yeah.
Well, people are so used to just being able to go on Amazon and buying what they want.
Yeah.
You know, but even then, right, there's an exchange. I have to give something up to get it, right? I have to give money, which for most people is a form of energy, right? Because I had to work to get the money. You have to give that over to get something. So everything you do in the material realm and beyond really has to be transactional. Are you willing? You want this? Right. Can you afford it? Are you willing to pay the price? You know, and that's the thing. I mean, spirituality at its highest levels, and I consider magic very, very spiritual. I don't use magic for material means.
Right.
You know, it's magic. I use it exclusively towards spiritual aims, exclusively. I don't mean to disparage people who are experimenting with it and seeing how it manifests in their lives, and so therefore are experimenting.
I was just watching something the other day about that whole concept. It was like, because it's funny, you figured there would be a definitive answer to this, but like, is it possible to transmute one metal into another, right? Some people will say yes, some people will say no. It's like, how come we can't agree on this thing, right? And there's the people that are like, oh well, if you have like, outside of like a particle accelerator,
right,
you can't really like transmute one matter into another. But then there's like other instances of like, yeah, like you can totally do that. And then producing gold, it's like, you can do it, but the cost of all the products that you need to make it happen, plus the cost of all the material and all of the equipment, and plus the yield you're going to get. I mean, talk about spending like, tens of thousands of dollars to produce like a tiny little droplet of gold. You're like, oh, you can do it, but like, it defeats the point. And now if you're an alchemist, the point is the operation. Right. It doesn't matter how much it costs or what kind of equipment you need. The point is to go through that operation. So I guess in that situation, yeah, making gold or making whatever is worth it. It's worth it if your goal is to get closer to source.
Right.
It's not worth it if your goal is to like get material gains.
Buy stuff. Yeah. Unfortunately.
Yeah.
So how long have you been a Mason?
Yeah, I think almost 9 years.
Almost 9 years.
Yeah.
And you've sat in the East.
Mm-hmm.
Did you do 2 years in the East?
Yeah, because my first year was COVID year.
Yeah.
We were shut down for a while and didn't get to do a lot of stuff. So
yeah,
the lodge just kept the officers where they were.
Yeah. So and your primary focus in Masonry has been Blue Lodge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that you've wanted to focus here. Is there anything you are one of the most skilled people in terms of the memorization of this stuff, and you're even almost like a monitor when someone's giving a charge or giving a lecture. You're always following along from the secretaries. Never mind being secretary now.
Yeah, I don't know how that happened.
But no secretary does. But being as well versed and immersed in all the verbiage of Masonry as you are, do you draw any parallels between Masonry and what you study in Taoism and alchemy?
Yeah, that's a good question too, because I've obviously been looking at that, and Freemasonry coming primarily from a Western tradition. I was curious how much crossover there is, and I guess the answer to that is I would say just how we mentioned that the ultimate goal of Western alchemy and Western magic is the same. So I guess I would see that parallel, but yeah, I haven't, just because the systems are so different that it's hard to see certain parallels in them, Plus, Masonry is weird. It's got the whole like Hiramic legend, and there's a lot going on with that, and that's unique to Freemasonry.
Yeah. Yeah, but there one of the first things that struck me when I was going through the different catechisms, particularly, because that's when you're putting it all together. As somebody who just went through all this stuff. For instance, you're reciting your obligation, but you're just trying to hang on. You're not really absorbing. Right. You don't have time in the middle of the actual ritual to think about these things. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the catechism, you're going over and over and over, and you're thinking about, what am I saying here? And there is something, I'm not going to be explicit about it, but there is something distinctly elemental.
Yes.
There is definitely something elemental. And I think you had pointed out this whole, in the Western alchemical tradition, I believe it would be called the Balneum Mariae, and that's the bath by water, by the sea.
Yeah.
And there's some of that too in some of the Masonic verbiage. That really kind of perked my ear up. Like, okay, I should be looking for alchemical stuff here.
Right. Yeah, some of it's like very in your face. You're like, oh, okay. And again, as you mentioned, I'm strictly Blue Lodge. Not that I have anything against dependent bodies. I'll probably join it in some point in the future. But I've heard that Yorkite has a lot of that stuff. It's like you'll look at like someone like yourself who's well versed in like the Western Esoteric Tradition and be like, oh, I recognize that like right away. There's no beating around the bush.
Yeah, I think, and I'm not going to talk about it, but I will say that in the third degree, there is immediate. Oh, this is the zodiac.
Yeah.
This is the zodiac.
Right.
And it's talking about the zodiac in the context of its elemental triplicities.
Or like, very basics. So once you become a Freemason and you look at, like, say the High Priestess card in the Tarot, you're like, oh, that's like straight Masonic.
Right.
Like 100%.
Yeah.
They're not even trying to hide anything.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that card really was designed by a Freemason, right?
Yeah.
Arthur Edward Waite. So. Of course, drawn by Pamela Coleman Smith, but Waite was the one who conceptualized the basic design for all that stuff. I mean, her art really is what put it over the top.
Yeah.
The color palette she used and everything, but Waite kind of was the brains behind
it.
Exactly. I mean, that's kind of all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else that you wanted to like touch on or talk about concerning Freemasonry and your journey there and how that kind of interacts with what you do on the side?
Well, it is interesting because I've noticed that a lot of people like Brian, for example, someone who started out in a very like Eastern philosophy, whether it's like Theravada, like Buddhism, Vajrayana. Actually, it was Vajrayana that he was into for years. Krishna consciousness and like Vaishnavism, that sort of stuff, and then full into like the Western. And that was like kind of the opposite, like I was into the whole like, I guess you can't say Egyptian is Western, but yeah, whether it's that or more like Western pagan style stuff, like I don't really know how or when I started getting into like Eastern philosophy because I wasn't early, but it's just interesting to see how I've come back full circle, in Freemasonry, and I guess I got into Masonry at a time that I needed it, but I was also, having studied that sort of stuff before, I got into Masonry for the esoteric aspect. And I think we've had this conversation too. It's interesting. Almost everyone I know that's gotten into Masonry for the esoteric find that the camaraderie is something that like,
oh yeah,
it's like, oh, like I didn't do Masonry to like be in a boys club at all, but like I get a lot out of hanging out with people like we're doing now.
Yeah. Absolutely. It's something that's sorely missing in the communities that I've been a part of in my lifetime. Unless you're like trauma bonded with somebody, like on a bomb squad or something like that, or in the military, or let's say if you play on a sports team. I mean, how do men really bond? We don't. That's been the whole part of the whole game for so long in society was take men and send them out there to compete for resources. And so it's like we're constantly butting heads with each other. Nobody really sees that because there are sort of rules to this game and how you interact with people, but it becomes tiresome. It becomes tiresome, I think, to constantly be comparing myself to another man and basing like my sense of self-worth in that almost that adversarial way. And you come together. Masonry gives you an excuse to come together, really, and really, really bond. We call each other brother.
Yeah. Well, you got to remember the details that Joe was talking about because you weren't at the meeting.
Which one?
The one we just had.
No, I didn't.
Yeah. And he was talking about that. One of the questions that was come up was like, why no women in Freemasonry? And of course, there's a bunch of answers about that. That's another topic that we could talk about later, But he had a really good explanation. But at its core, he's like, well, essentially, it's because women don't need this. They have their own thing that they're doing. What we do in Masonry as men is not really something that would be appealing to women or even like really benefit them. So it's not like that they're not allowed. It's just like, even if they were in, they'd be like, oh, okay, you guys are doing this. Like, I don't really need this.
Yeah. Everybody's always got that one thing. Oh, you're a Mason? No, that's cool. Yeah. Congratulations. Have fun running the world.
Right. Who killed JFK?
Yeah, exactly. And by the way, have fun being a Mason. And by the way, how come women can't get involved?
Yeah.
And my experience in general in life has been this. Men can learn a tremendous amount from women. But there are some things you can only learn from a member of the same gender. There are some things you will only be able to learn from a man. And there are some things that women will only be able to learn from women. So there are some contexts, there are some lessons in this life that you can only learn from a person of your gender. And it also affirms what you're going through when you talk to somebody who's having the same experience, or when you talk to an elder and they give you their take on, how I managed this. And
yeah, and since the topic is alchemy, I mean, I would apply that directly to this, what we're talking about, relationship. It's like, one of the processes in alchemy. So, for example, you're trying to extract the essence of something and like purify it, right? Mm-hmm. So take like spagyric alchemy. When you like calcinate plant material, you burn it into ash, right? And all that's left is ash, and then you dissolve that ash, typically in water or something like that, right? Filter that out, and then evaporate all the water, and you get that salt that's left, right? Yeah. You're essentially like extracting the physical essence of a plant and then purifying it. And that's what Masonry is attempting to do, is to extract the essence of who we are, get rid of all our vices and superfluities, right? Pull out that essence and then purify that. So if a man is doing that in Masonry, which you could use Masonry, you could use alchemy, you could use the teachings of the Golden Dawn, Taoist traditions, whatever, and his partner as a female is doing that, then you merge them back together to create something greater than the sum of its parts, right?
Quintessence.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's one of the arguments for that. You need to isolate these things so that you can extract and purify them and then recombine them. That's like, the great work, at least on that scale.
Have you thought of that before, or did you just think of that now?
I've thought about that before.
That is one of the most incredible parallels between alchemy and Masonry. It never even crossed my mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
The extraction of the salt.
Right.
Yeah,
because we're, that's what we're doing, being a fraternal society. We're just men, right? And women have their thing, whatever that is. But and as far as I know, and I'm probably wrong, but, Masonry is maybe not the only, but definitely one of the only oldest fraternal traditions that focuses specifically on the improvement of the self and the mind, philosophy and spirituality. Absolutely. And that sort of thing. A lot of other things probably came out of Freemasonry, or Freemasonry influenced a lot of other things, such as the Hermetic Order, the Golden Dawn, and other stuff.
Oh, yeah. And
all of those are, as far as I understand, co-ed, if that's what I'm looking for. Like both men and women can be members of they could be Rosicrucians. Men and women could be members of the Golden Dawn, whereas Freemasonry, you're doing that thing where you're separating to purify that essence and with the intention of recombining it.
And I avoided Masonry for the longest time because it seemed imbalanced.
Me too.
I like the Golden Dawn because it's got men and women. And then I come to Masonry and like...
Right. Yeah, and I mean, imagine if you and your partner are on the same spiritual journey and you both join the same organization and you do that journey together. That's a completely different thing than doing your journey separately and then coming back together.
Yeah.
And if you're doing that work, if you're taking that work seriously, you're stirring things up, you're shifting things in your being, and and I mean, I've seen it happen in Taoist alchemy too. I mean, I've heard of a lot of people that same thing happens. They'll like start this practice and start, doing this stuff for real, and things start changing, and all of a sudden, their partner's like, you're changing, you're a different person. It's like, yeah, like that's the point, like that's why I'm doing it, and like it doesn't always work, But then again, I've seen the opposite happen too, where like two people meet and bond over that, and it's like, oh, I think we're like on the same path, like we're a good complement to each other, and relationships form that way. So
it's difficult when you're doing a self-centered work with a partner. You're supposed to be a team, and you're going through this intense period, this prolonged period, typically 3 to 4 years in the outer order, and that's going fast.
Yeah.
3 or 4 years in the outer order focused on yourself. You can become disconnected from the other person. But, if that path is what brought them together in the first place, I think a lot of times you have to learn to have this mutual support with each other.
Or two people that are in the process of changing, knowing that like this is what we're doing. We're improving ourselves, and we're going to change, and still the same person, so to speak. You know, you're not all of a sudden decided to like, I don't know, become a pirate. You know? It's like you're still you, but you're a more developed, more refined version of you.
Hopefully.
Ultimately, yeah.
Hopefully. Again, look at Crowley.
Yeah, true.
So, last question for you, and this is the one that I've given so far everybody a heads up on. 3 books, films, movies, influential people related to our topic tonight or the broader topic that you think other people would benefit by checking out.
Yeah, and I didn't really do my homework on that.
Well, that's fine. Improvise.
The kind of, like I mentioned before, the Taoist alchemy, like as I practice it, is in its most refined form in the West, was originally brought over here by Montauk Chia's work. So I would definitely look at that. I consider Michael Wynn and Healing Tao USA to be like probably the pinnacle, the cutting edge of that sort of like spiritual alchemical science.
We talked about Michael. We talked about Michael Wynn.
Yeah.
I don't think we touched on Healing Tao.
Yeah, that's the organization, right?
Okay.
So yeah, Healing Tao was originally created by Montauk Chia, and Michael like actually wrote the books, many of the books from Montauk, because Montauk had the knowledge, but his English wasn't very good, right?
Got it.
But he went so far in what he knew, and then Michael like took it further and created, all the stuff that's going on with that. So if you're interested in Taoist alchemy, I would say look at Michael Wynn's work. He's again on the cutting edge of that sort of stuff. Definitely got the most refined view of it in actual practices. Because I'm at a time, and I feel like you're in the same places where like I've done enough reading, done enough like study, like I want to like practice.
Yeah. That's been a benefit of being involved with something like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. I've been forced to practice. But I will say this. Recently, I'm talking about like the last 3 months, I've there's a lot more for me to learn about the system, right? I'm only a Zelator Adeptus Minor. I'm about halfway through, 3/4 of the way through that curriculum. But something in me wants to, like you were saying earlier, kind of use my intuition combined with what I know to do something that is personally feels a little bit more right. I'm starting to feel like that's where I'm being called. I had a really good friend that was an adept in the New York Temple with me, and she said something which is only now really striking me. As Golden Dawn magicians, we're like highly classically trained musicians, but some people out there are playing jazz. And I'm not saying that I want to go off the rails. I that's how I started out. I know it can be dangerous, but now I have these kind of like a very structured way to approach scrying, astral travel, ritual, entity contact. I have a very, very safe way of doing that now.
But that's what makes that's what defines an alchemist, is their willingness to experiment. You learn the way, you learn the method, so you know what you're doing. Practical alchemy, so you don't blow yourself up, right? But then you experiment. It's like I was mentioning with the microcosmic orbit, that's how all the new ones were developed, and that's how you realize, oh, this is like super powerful. You're like tapping into something that I wasn't before, instead of just like circulating it up and down the Ren and Do channels. It's like, oh, well, what if I take that like pearl and split it and send one up the front and one up the back and merge at the top and go straight down this core channel and then split and do that. It's like, that sounds crazy. Turns out super powerful. What about the side channels? Focus on spinning them, focus on different qualities, colors or elemental qualities. I would encourage you not to go off the rails, but I would definitely encourage you to experiment and do new things with what you already know.
Well, that's why this was so important to me, because my trajectory in terms of, I researched and learned about lots of Eastern philosophies early on, but not in a practical way, not in an esoteric way. I learned I got initiated into the Golden Dawn magic in one weekend. The next weekend I had my first Reiki attunement, And then a month later, I started training in body work, Asian body work, and I did massage, and then I went into the Acu program. So all of this stuff started happening pretty much in tandem, and it just seemed so obvious to me that what we're doing in magic is the same. We're using the same kind of forces that are present in the Eastern energy work, and they're two sides of the same coin. But if you don't understand the other side, you don't have the whole coin. And I think that's what the Western tradition is missing. Right. It's missing this conception of energy work. There's this Taoist alchemist, alchemical practice called the casting of fu. Essentially, you create these. Some of them will use the trigrams or the hexagrams from the I Ching, but typically, or at least 50-50, they're kind of these channeled sigils that somewhat resemble the Chinese figure.
Okay. Yeah.
Related to it, but they somewhat resemble the typical Chinese pictograms that would be understood by most people native to that language. But they're slightly different. They're altered, and it comes from this intuited or channeled sense of what this sigil needs to be for them. Right. And they take that, and typically there's a ritual similar to Golden Dawn ritual. They invoke the four quarters, same way the Golden Dawn invokes the four archangels, attributed to the four winds. Right. It's not an elemental ritual. You're calling the directions. It's a directional ritual. The lesser ritual and greater rituals of the pentagram, they do the same thing to open up a space so that they can charge this fu, right? This sigil that they've drawn typically on virgin parchment. And they've kind of intuited this sigil. It's not really based on something, only they know what it is. And you move the chi through your hands into the sigil. And it's consecrated in that fashion. And it's the same thing in the Golden Dawn. We project the energy by a movement of the hands, and a visualization. So it's, that's some Taoist magic.
Yeah, it reminds me of a practice where you're essentially, it's the cube, right? So like if you're in the center, you have your four directions and you're doing a bunch of stuff, one of which is projecting like spinning bagwas and stuff. But there's also the above and the below with you in the center. You're creating this like cube, which you can manipulate to expand to the size of the planet or just like the room or whatever. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of that. And I was thinking too, because you're talking about like intuiting or whatever it is. I had failed to mention earlier. I forgot your question, but I started talking about like Tibetan Bon and how it's just now starting to come out, and how it's hard to find stuff on Taoist alchemy. There's not a lot of books written on it. The interesting thing about what Montauk and like Michael are doing is they're essentially like giving away all the secrets, right? Yeah. But it self-regulates, right? Because the people that are not ready for it won't go to it, and the people that do go to it and it's like too much, they'll either drop it or move elsewhere. You don't really find people showing up that like would abuse that sort of thing. Yeah. Like I said, it lays it out right there. If you're looking to like get rich and powerful and a bunch of women, like it's not going to give it to you. But if you're looking to like, again, build that neutral force to speed up your spiritual evolution to get closer to source, if that's what you're looking for, then it's going to be your thing. Yeah.
That's exactly what the Golden Dawn system is supposed to be doing, right? You're supposed to be. There are several rituals in the Golden Dawn. They're out there, right? They're in the black brick.
Right.
I'm not necessarily giving away any secrets. But there are several rituals where you attempt to go to the left and to the right. I can think of two right off the top of my head. The Zalata ritual and the portal ritual. You attempt to go to the left. No, can't go this way. Go back. Send them the other way. Goes to the right. No, can't go this way. Go back. You're constantly being reverted up the middle pillar, which is the way of mildness, the way of neutrality.
Right.
It's the same thing. Blows my mind. And even when you're talking about the cube, there's a teaching in the Golden Dawn called the cube of space. It's the same thing you're talking about.
Well, and even in Masonry, again, I don't think I'm giving anything away too much, but like in most of the rituals, and it comes up in the first degree like a lot, is like you keep trying to get to the east, and you keep getting stopped and turn
Sent
around,
back.
like, go back and do this. And it's like, okay, I did that. It's like, oh, no, okay, well, now you got to go back and do this. But each time you get closer and closer until finally you get there and you're taught your lesson, given the working tools, that sort of thing.
That's
but
interesting.
you keep trying to get there, and you keep sending you back.
I hadn't realized that you do eventually get there, and you get your working tools.
Mm-hmm. But there's also that moment, because that's the first thing I thought. Y'all know if I'm giving away too much here, but there's a point where you come back and you're put in the northeast corner, where you're in between two things. You have a choice. You can go this way or this way. Go to the light in the east, or the darkness back to the north. That's why you're in the northeast, because now you have a choice. You've made it to that section, that part, and now you're like, what are you gonna do? Where are you gonna go? You're in that liminal space, that neutral space almost between the two, but it's still your free will.
And at that point, you're told, like, you're a Mason now. Act like one.
Yeah.
You're like,
Yeah.
I'm going to give you some advice. Don't go that way. That's pretty interesting. So you gave me 2.
Yeah, I mean, I know I already mentioned it before, but if anybody's like completely new to like the whole thing, I would recommend checking out The Ancient Secret of the Flower of Life. It's
Really?
it's one of those things that just is like, you may have heard a little of this, a little of that, a little of this, a little of that, but that like coalesces it all into like one thing. It's like, oh, see all this stuff? See how they're connected? Like this is the thing that we're working with now. Now that you know all this, choose your path. Like, I wouldn't say that is a path in and of itself, but it can be for sure. But at least for me, it was like it brought it all together and was like, this is the reality that we're working with. This is the shit that's going on. This is, whether it's like the ancient past or like, our connection to spirit, or like where we're going in the future, having all that knowledge and be like, oh, okay, from this, I can now start to like choose whatever spiritual path I'm on.
That's interesting. For some reason, right, as I said, I was aware of it. I've seen it in every time you go into the I guess what it used to be, the metaphysics, then it was the occult, and now finally Barnes and Noble has labeled it the self-improvement. But it was always there, and for some reason I always conflated it. I grouped it in with like the David Icke stuff, which I'm not really into it. I'm not saying I think anything. I don't think ill or good of him, just because I'm completely unfamiliar with his stuff, other than he talks a lot about aliens, which is kind of cool. But I'm not sure I'm ready to go there just yet. But I kind of I conflated the two together. Is that a false conception that I had?
I mean, I think in the realm that you're talking about, like ancient Earth history, because that's when you start getting super woo-woo, and you're like, oh, what? Because it's funny, I've noticed, and I use that term woo-woo lovingly, right? Yeah. I definitely consider us woo-woo. In that community, in the woo community, there's like different levels of woo.
Oh, yeah.
It's like, I'm cool with this, I'm cool with that. Like, for example, like I'm cool with like the idea of ghosts, right? And I'm cool with the idea of extraterrestrials. Even cool with the idea of Bigfoot, but Atlantis, and that book will do that to you. It'll be like, it'll take you. It's like, oh, that makes sense. Like, oh, that's what that means. I see the connection. That's crazy. I don't know if I believe that at all.
Right.
And it gives you. So in that respect, I guess it's somewhere. He doesn't talk about aliens all the time. He's not like David Icke, but it's definitely, especially, and I keep bringing up the whole like Earth history thing. It's like the idea that there's more in the past of human evolution than just like caveman evolved into like Romans, and now it's us.
And somewhere Fred Flintstone he's tossed in the mix.
So it pushes your boundaries of like what you believe, or but there's like a lot of truth and stuff in it as well, and it gives you you do get the practice. I mean, I would say that's probably the most important thing.
Oh, yeah.
The other thing I forgot, there's a Chinese saying that talking doesn't cook the rice, right? Like there's an important time to like talk about stuff, important time to read about stuff, but eventually you got to do it. Like
I love that.
Yeah,
man.
Talking doesn't cook the rice, so you gotta.
That's one of the reasons why I mean, for like 5 years I wanted to do some kind of YouTube channel or podcast. not because I want to focus on myself, but because I really feel like and maybe this is the same with everybody else who's ever spoken out, but I feel like I've gotten in contact with a way through the woo, right? It's like that Ariadnean thread that gets you out of the labyrinth, because you can get lost in Wonderland here.
You definitely can.
You really can, and I did for a long time. And this particular system and the way that I've come to understand it has provided me with a conceptualization that makes it clear to me. Everything makes sense. Life makes more sense, and maybe that's kind of like this psychological projection of me kind of wanting to validate my own viewpoint. But I am a firm believer that, again, another great lesson I had from one of my favorite teachers in the ACU program was, her name was Lizelle. She said, when you inevitably graduate and you go off and you open your own practice, don't worry. It doesn't matter if you open up a practice and somebody opens up down the street from you. Don't worry about that. Because the patients who need your style of treatment, your style of understanding this, they're going to come to you. And you're going to be the only person that can help them in that way. And I feel the same way about what I'm doing here, still kind of on the fence about doing. But I've seen just in teaching, there's a lot of people who really don't jive with me. They don't like my style. But there's a few people who really, really do. And it helps them. And so that's kind of what I'm hoping to do with this. But the main thing that pushed me into it recently is that I have seen an overwhelming presence of strictly academic conversations regarding the occult. Nobody wants to commit.
Right.
Nobody wants to show their cards and say, I believe it. Believe is a 4-letter word. In our modern society. So they'll talk about it without saying anything. Well, this is really, really interesting. We love talking about it. I don't believe in a jot of it. And so I know for a fact there's people out there who want to learn this stuff from a practitioner's point of view. And so that's why I'm kind of like having these conversations. And, I've done a couple of YouTube videos that I haven't posted or anything yet to try and explain theoretical ideas. I'm not trying to become a guru. Nothing I have to say is original to me.
Right. And one thing that really brought that out, and I'm going to get a little political here, so for warning, I saw people that believed in alternative medicine, lived a lifestyle of eating healthy and herbal medicines, like against big pharma and the government because they're obviously corrupt, and all of a sudden, like overnight, they're like, oh, like, we got to take this drug, It's like, so I guess you never believed the stuff to begin with. Yeah. It was either cool for you or it was like a part of like an image or a personality trait. But like when the rubber hits the road, you're like, actually, I'm scared enough. I'm going to take this thing. Yeah. Even though like I've been saying like these people and this stuff is bad and I believe this. Whenever the truth comes out and people have to deal with stuff, you say, oh, like, I don't think they don't want to practice it. They like the reading,
Yeah, it's a lifestyle accessory.
Yeah.
It's an aesthetic. And look, I mean, some of our worst traits can bring us to the best things we ever do with our lives. So there's definitely something to be said, because at one point I was an aesthetic occultist.
Yeah.
And now I'm like, it's like boot camp over by me.
And it's funny, the people that I noticed that are like the deepest into it and the most like well versed and experienced and live that as their life look like you and I.
Right. Yeah.
They don't look like the crystal hippie you see walking down the street.
Yeah.
You know? And whatever that means, I'm not saying that crystal hippies can't be deep into their practice, but the people that I know, and you're one of them, that have spent a long time going real deep, and it's a part of their life, and they're making progress. Like, it's not their aesthetic.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, you could be walking around in like robes and a hood.
I mean, well, I remember I got all these tattoos. That was like a thing for me for a while, playing in music.
Yeah.
And
I got all these esoteric tattoos, the Ouroboros, the Tetractys.
I mean, they are cool.
Yeah, they're cool, but cool and $2.75 gets me on the subway. I'm through being cool, thank God.
Yeah.
I don't think I ever was cool, but, but I was trying. And the thing is, I remember I got all this stuff. I was like still in kind of the more Masonic understanding of this stuff, like the Manly Palmer Hall School. I really like mahogany bookshelves and leather chairs, and that's kind of what I'm into. But also the occult. And I read The Mystical Kabbalah by Dion Fortune. Dion Fortune is one of my favorite esoteric teachers of all time.
Yeah.
A lot of what she said, a lot of what she did that is in bad taste today was not in bad taste at her time. She conformed with the norms of her society, as we all do. Who knows, in 10 years, we're going to look back and be like, ooh. You got to forgive some, or at least have understanding of that. But, because that's what a lot of people will bash her for. That and kind of like this prudery when it came to magic, because you had her and Crowley at the same time. He's saying, do what thou wilt, sodomizing Victor Newberg in the Egyptian desert, taking Quaaludes and cocaine, and she's like, no, you need to control yourself if you're going to be able to handle this power, if and when it comes. But one of the most devastating lines I ever read in occultism, I opened that book up, and I think it's in the first introductory chapter. True spirituality requires no advertisement. And people will disagree with that, but it hit me hard. And I was like, shit, I wish I would have known that before I spent like $1,000 on tattoos.
I mean, I see it here in Asheville too, and I want to be clear that I'm not like talking trash or bashing anybody or any like system or whatever, but I do see it a lot in Asheville. People that are deep into the spiritual community and have been for years, and they do all their stuff. They go religiously to like yoga classes, and they read all of their books, and they do their meditation, and do their ayahuasca journeys and stuff, but still like depressed, still upset, still like just, it's not, whatever they're doing is doing something for them, but it's not getting them where they want to go. Right. Whereas I see other people that maybe aren't doing any of that stuff, but they're on this path. Right. And it's I guess I'm saying you can't really judge it either way.
You can't. Yeah, that's the important take home from that, is that it's not that it's bad, but it's not the most surefire. Like the way a person looks is not the most surefire way to judge whether or not they're spiritual. Now, now, I mean, hasn't that been age-old wisdom, right? Don't judge a book by its cover. We normally associate that with like, don't make negative judgments, but just don't make judgments. Period. Off of what they look like. That's really what the saying, I think, is alluding to.
And I think that does happen in the spiritual community. I'm sure you've seen it. And when I say spiritual community, that's an umbrella term. We're talking about like New Agers versus, ritual magicians. Mm-hmm. It's all under the same umbrella, right? But you'll see, you definitely see that. I was talking to somebody the other day who was talking about, it might be a little risque for your podcast, but talking about how they had gone to a BDSM show somewhere, not in Nashville. It's like another city, and of course they'd never been to one, and it was like a little uncomfortable. Their friend like took them, kind of like dragged them along, and this person had been like in this quote spiritual community for a while, and it's like, the first thing I noticed, I mean, aside from all the weird stuff going on, was that like everybody was super friendly and like super welcoming, and like nobody was judging anybody about anything. Mm-hmm. It's like, coming from that spiritual community, it's like you get a lot of judgy people, There's a lot of, holier than thou going on, and it's just interesting because you would think that the whole point of spirituality is to transcend that, and then you get these people that are apparently like depraved doing weird BDSM stuff who are like, they've done that work, they're not judging anybody for anything, and everybody's welcome. I thought that was an interesting statement.
It's really hairy work when you get involved with spirituality, because we have so much of what we understand or think we understand about spirituality that's spoon-fed to us through the media. People continually, underestimate how influential and significant the media is, of all kinds: books, movies, television. Your mental diet is extremely important, but we automatically associate spiritual power with this kind of white light, very good, very gentle, very kind, and I'll be maybe the first or second or third person to tell you that you can attain spiritual power and not be good. You can become awake in the dream of reality and still be a dark, depraved person.
Or maybe you've done 90% of the work, 95, 98, 99% of the work, but there's that 1% that you haven't transmuted yet. That's where you see like certain high-level spiritual masters who are now spiritual teachers who end up, maybe they haven't transmuted their sexual identity, so they end up like hooking up with their students. You see that in the whole yoga community a lot, or
see that in the massage community when I was in that school.
Like they got it together, but they're kind of an asshole, so they haven't like really transmuted that aspect.
That would probably be how most people explain me.
He knows his stuff. He's really got it there, but he's kind of a dick.
Well, you know what the thing is? One of the axioms in Western occultism, specifically alchemy, is separate the subtle from the gross with great industry and a gentle heat. It's a subtle heat that eventually, gets more, I guess, rapid or violent. But it has to start with a gentle heat. And who knows how long that alchemical process takes for each person. Nobody's ever completely black or white.
Right.
A lot of gray area, but I would say that I verged on the black, the jet black. And so for somebody who knew me like 15 years ago, even like 10 years ago, to see me now, stone sober, I own a home, I have a long-term partner, finished school, like most people would not recognize me.
Right.
So it's like the problem with a lot of the spiritual community is that the failure to recognize that I am, even though I'm on a spiritual path, you're meeting me at a specific point in my journey. I'm still in process.
Yeah.
So it's like there's a lot of that we forget. Like I'm not some, everybody expects you to be this divine, evolved being if you're quote unquote spiritual, but according to their own perception of what that means.
Right. I was thinking of Alan Watts. You familiar with Alan Watts?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, apparently he was a pretty heavy alcoholic, like most of his life, if not all of it. Dude had it together. Super wise. Definitely tapped in, changed a lot of people's lives. And then of course that also begs the question: is like, well, does that mean that it was bad that he was an alcoholic? I mean, I guess because it's not. He probably would have lived a lot longer.
Yeah.
But it's just an interesting concept.
It is. A lot of times, I was talking about this with my sister earlier today, believe it or not. You think about all the suffering you have to go through, and when you're on the other side of that, you're like, why did I have to go through that? But then you realize, like, I would still be the person I was before that happened today if it hadn't. So, like, our suffering, the things we struggle with and the things we wrestle with are typically, right, if you're drowning, typically you try to swim to the air. You know what I'm saying? It's like, and it's the same thing with the dark happenings of our life. It forces us in the opposite direction. Right? Once you hit rock bottom, like you have to go away from it, or you lay there and die.
Right.
So
yeah, and I guess that leads me to the final thing that I was going to say is about how just bringing it back to that center, to that neutral force. I've heard it said that you don't try to fight the dark side because the dark side thrives on conflict and fighting. So like you'll never win. What you do is you stay in that neutral place. You build that neutrality because the whole point of like I keep using the term dark side, but that the whole point of that is to separate, to divide. If the universe is in a constant state of expansion and contraction, it's trying to hold everything at contraction, not let it expand, right? So if you're focused on that neutral and you're building the neutral force in yourself, it has no power over you because you're not in polarity. You're in like a unity consciousness, if you will.
I gotta say, man, I learned a tremendous amount from this conversation. I'm gonna be thinking about it on the drive home.
Me too, man. Yeah, we should definitely do more.
Yeah, absolutely. You let me know when. Worshipful brother Phil Queen, thank you so much for talking with me, man. It's a real pleasure, dude.
Yeah.